Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Labor Talk. We're here this week with Dan Block, the Vice President of Client Relations at Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants, and a tenured Human Resources and Labor Relations Consultant. How are you today, Dan?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you.
Excellent. And of course, we're here with Rick Torres, the CEO and President of Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants. Rick, how are you?
Doing great, James. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking. Okay, guys, today I want to talk about the supervisor's role in maintaining a positive employee relations environment. We talk a lot about supervisors on our program, and I know you both have a lot of experience in dealing with, training, and even acting as supervisors yourselves. So, Dan, let's start with you since you're our guest. Could you explain just the essence of a supervisor's role in maintaining that positive workplace environment?
Sure, I appreciate that. You know, all too often, James, I feel that a lot of companies really don't understand the weight of the responsibility that a supervisor has in maintaining a positive labor relations environment. Because ultimately, it comes down to the fact of communications. Effective, coherent, consistent communications that is mutually appreciated and understood by all parties. And I'll expand on that a little bit. All too often, what I think we see happen is that executive leadership molds a message that they wish to relay to all of the population in a company. And certainly they all have a sense of understanding what that message is. But as that message is disseminated through the ranks, as it gets to that level of the first line supervisor, all too often we see that perhaps there's a disconnect, a misinterpretation of what that message is, and ultimately it could have a serious impact and negative result to the subordinates of the main body of population for the company if they truly do not understand what that message is.
Well, you know, Dan. Also, I think it's important to understand that the frontline supervisor, the supervisor that is more directly communicating with the employees, whether it be in healthcare, non-healthcare, it doesn't really matter, is the most important part of management. With the more important than say the CEO or the president, because they're the ones who deal with them on a regular basis. You know, and listening to your answer, Dan, and you explaining the role of the supervisor, so many times, and this is what really gets frustrating sometimes. So many times when upper management talks about, yes, we want to have a positive role, we want to have a positive communication, we want to have, we want to have a good relationship with our employees. That so many times that the intent is good, and the intent usually works through the floor when times are running smooth. But what happens so many times, and this is what really gets which when the workers start talking about inconsistency, is when times are smooth and everything's running good, it's easy to be a good supervisor. But the consistency of being a good supervisor is even more important when times are running rough, when things aren't so smooth, when things start getting backed up. Then all of a sudden that top-down message, and it's a good message, but the upper management has to buy into it completely. In fact, what I like to say is positive communications part of your corporate DNA. But they have to understand also, as it comes down to the front line, if upper management starts yelling and screaming at the frontline supervisors to get things moving, then their natural recourse is going to take that frustration and that hostility and that attitude out on the floor.
So I think what you're touching up on here, Rick, is something that Dan mentioned before about that consistent communication.
Right.
So what we want to do here, and what you're suggesting for the top-level executives all the way down to the frontline supervisors, is a calm, collected, comprehensive, and most importantly, consistent level and type of communication.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yes.
You want to avoid, what, for lack of a better word, would call, a game of corporate telephone. Okay, so let's talk about that game of corporate telephone a little bit, that breakdown in communication. We've all been there when we were younger. It was a common game to show us the perspective of other people and how messages can be, they can be broken down, they can be misconstrued, miscommunicated. How does that happen in your guys' experience in the workplace?
Well, James, really, think of it this way. As the communication is two ways. It's a two-way street. And as we were touching on a moment ago with Rick, as the communication is being disseminated from executive leadership through to the main body of population, the hourly folks, the same is true going the other way. The feedback and ultimately rumor control. And all of that rumor control must be filtered through that first line supervisor. And clearly, that is where a lot of the times the breakdown happens, because the supervisor may not be well trained or really may not have a strong experience to understand how to dissect that information, how to respond, how to inform other chains of command and chain of custody so that appropriate follow-up can be conducted. Because clearly, if anyone has any problems or concerns, or even expressions of appreciation, they want to be able to get the feedback to know exactly what the company thinks about that.
Yeah, absolutely right on, Dan. And not only that, there has to be a system to take it back up to upper management also. And so many times there's no system, there's no process to take what is disseminated on the floor between the employees and the frontline supervisors back up, whether it be a positive message or a negative message. There's many times there's just no system to be able to do that. Who do we go to? Who do we talk to? Do they even want to hear it when we go and talk to them? Once again, it's the consistency of where we go and how we communicate these messages.
Sure, I feel like a lot of those base people, those hourly workers that we're referring to here, I feel as though they feel like the company is only concerned with the negative. They don't receive positive feedback, or when they have something to say to their frontline supervisors that's positive, they may not feel as though the top level executives, the end goal for that gateway that those supervisors provide care about that message or want to hear that message. So what could a supervisor do, or what are some things that supervisors could do to really facilitate that two-way street of communication?
Well, I'll tell you one of the biggest problems to address the question that you're asking now is you certainly don't want a supervisor to be a rogue. You don't want them to be responding inappropriately to any comments, criticism, complaint, or because the problem is a lot of times if there's a problem or an issue that is addressed to the first line supervisor, if they take the side of the employee without truly identifying the company's position on the matter, that is where the breakdown typically happens, because they do represent management.
Yeah, Dan, also, and we're talking about mechanical issues, but there's also a whole nother side of that. Also, is when we're talking about personal issues. When we're talking about someone may have problems at home, or they may have issues regarding their kids or their marriage or health issues, and it's not mechanical things that are handled easily, through upper management. Okay, what do we do? It's a problem, but it's not my problem, it's your problem. So there has to be an understanding of how you deal with people also on that personal level when they have personal issues that are happening within their lives or within their families' lives.
But don't you think also, Rick, the part of that has to go back to the training process too? Because all too often we see every type of business, Fortune 100 companies to small family-owned operations, and they take their best employee off the line, the one who they think, wow, they're always on time, they're always accountable, they're respected by their peers. I know, let's promote them into a supervisor role because they're good at the job. But unfortunately, a lot of times, as strong as the strengths are that they have to the talents and the skill level to do the job, they lack the necessary component to be a good supervisor.
I agree with you 100%. The thing about it is just because someone's good at one thing, running a machine or healthcare or non-healthcare, it doesn't matter. Just because someone's good at one thing doesn't mean that automatically they're going to be a good supervisor. And I think when you promote someone to a supervisory position, you have to give them the skills to be able to supervise. And I'm talking about dealing with people on a personal level also. So many times when management looks at, okay, we want a supervisor, and you look at the mechanical reasons why you want a supervisor. They know the operation, they know the mechanics of the operation, they know how to get this widget through the production line out to the to shipping and receiving and out to the customers. But where is the training when it talks about how do we work with resolution, disputes on the floor? How do we deal with these personal issues that come up? And a lot of times it's lost when you go up to upper management. They say, well, that's not our problem, that's not our issue. But this is what begins the downward spiral that so many times management has, the employees have with management, is when they stop listening and talking to them on a personal level. It may not mean anything as far as your corporate structure, but to the employees on the ground who have these issues and these problems, it is everything to them. It is everything to them. And James, that's what creates that downward spiral, the mistrust, the miscommunication, and it goes down from there.
Right. So what I'm gathering here is that you can't apply a mechanical solution to a personal problem. But what it does seem like you can do is apply a mechanical solution to enable your supervisors to solve those personal problems. Vis-a-vis training, human relations coaching, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell you, a lot of times, even folks higher in the chain of command, perhaps they don't really even have that appropriate skill set, especially when you have a company that, is really growing, and they're trying to expand and they're bringing on additional people, and you have to have the right number of management. They certainly are challenged with those problems very frequently, and ultimately that's where we see a lot of our clientele come from.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more complicated, and I think Dan hit it right on when he stated at the beginning of this podcast that the role of the frontline supervisor is very complicated, and it has many different levels to it, and how he needs to be able to communicate with his people, both upper and lower.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Rick. The complication of that term supervisor. I feel like a lot of employees have a manager, they have a director, they have an executive officer, they have team leaders, and they may have a supervisor. But which of these people are a supervisor? What justifies a supervisor? What differentiates that between something like a manager or a director or a chief executive? Or are they all supervisors?
Well, you know what? And there's no defined definition of what a supervisor is. It's not the title that makes someone, officially, legally a supervisor.
Sure.
It's the job functions that make them, within the legal terms, a supervisor or a manager.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Rick. And I tell you, as impressive as it may sound, and a pat on the back to be able to give someone a title as supervisor or manager or director, ultimately I think companies need to understand the legal consequences pertaining to law as far as the definitions are concerned. And the National Labor Relations Act, ever since it was originally scripted, truly does a pretty good job as far as attempting to define what a supervisor is. And we find many times where companies are faced with a situation where they have someone, quote unquote, with a title, James, of supervisor, but ultimately they don't fit the description, the actual definition by law, and therefore they actually are protected by the act.
Yeah, and Dan, and so many times, how many times, Dan, have we gone into a situation to where there's an organizing campaign and management is treating what they consider supervisors as supervisors and giving them information and talking to them, when in fact the information and the communication and the training that they're giving them
it seems here that there's a gap between what is protected, who is protected rather by the NLRA.
Giving them information and talking to them about strategy, about how to deal with the employees.
Unions obviously have a set of rules and regulations and protections for the employees, that body of workers that we're talking about. And then there are also a set of rules and regulations and protections for the company, that entity, that employer entity. But it seems to me that a supervisor is in this strange limbo area between those two places. Are they actually protected by the NLRA?
Well, a supervisor, a true supervisor, is not protected under the National Labor Relations Act. Only if, say, for instance, the company asks that supervisor to break the law. Then, in some circumstances, they could be protected under the National Labor Relations Act. But normally, no, they are not protected under the National Labor Relations Act. In fact, they have to be true to the company. And in fact, even say for instance, a supervisor was sympathetic to the union organizing campaign, and if they try to help that union organize against the will of the company, they could put the whole company in jeopardy by talking to them about who is supportive and who is not supportive, even if their ultimate goal is to help the union organize those workers. The union could still file a charge against the company because of that communication between the supervisor and the employees. Even if his goal is to help them, it could devastate a company, and they could find themselves in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, clearly the definition of a supervisor by the National Labor Relations Act defines a supervisor as an individual who has the authority acting in the interest of the employer to cause another employee to be hired, transferred, suspended, laid off, recalled, promoted, discharged, assigned, awarded. You get the idea here, James, obviously. And that excludes them from the definition of quote-unquote an employee per the Act. But again, I'd like to elaborate for just a moment on what Rick was saying, because again, as we are engaged with clientele and assisting them, a lot of times that supervisor is in this limbo stage because they don't understand what their role is. Oh, are they protected or are they not? But more importantly, they need to be very well aware that their actions have some serious consequences to them if it is construed that they are intimidating or promoting unionization in favor or against in that realm, because the employee's protected rights are then perhaps being violated.
So the supervisor's role, let's see, as it pertains to labor relations. So before a union comes in, what can a supervisor do, or what is a supervisor's role in that unionization campaign? When a union's looking at a company, what do they think about when they are examining the supervisors?
Just for clarification, James, you're asking the supervisor's role pertaining to labor relations. Obviously, the definition of labor relations means unionization. And really, that first step, should the supervisor have some type of education, just a general awareness of how labor relations or unionization evolves? How does the process happen? And how does it work? What are their rights? What are the rights of the employees? And clearly, as a practitioner of labor relations, we would encourage any and every company to make sure that their supervisors, again, that immediate first level of leadership with the subordinate staff, the employees, that they do have that general knowledge base. We're not here, nor is there an expectation that they become philosophers or doctorates in the idea of labor relations, but just to have a general knowledge of terminology and how processes work.
And you know what? Working with unions for 24 years and having over 1,000 organizing campaigns under my belt on the union side as an organizing director, I will tell you that when a union comes in to target a company, there's going to have to be some criteria set up. There's going to be some hurdles that have to be met. But basically what they're looking at, they're the same as if a state or federal inspector came to look at any infrastructure, whether it be a bridge or a tunnel or a building. They look for stresses and weaknesses within the foundation of that structure. The structure of a company the foundation of a company is that frontline relationship between the frontline supervisors and the employees. That's the structure of that company. So when I was on the other side and we used to look at, is this company going to be worth our time and our money and our effort to organize them? Because it's all about winning and losing.
Right.
I mean, it's not, hey, good try. It's all about winning. And if that relationship between the frontline supervisors and the employees is weak, and there's no respect, or there's problems and there's issues, and that communication is not fluid and the consistency is not there, then that is going to make them a target, because that is the fundamental issues that they look for when they go in and make the decision whether to organize a company or not.
So it seems that these frontline supervisors can be huge assets or liabilities on either side of that union campaign. So, for instance, a union is campaigning into a company. They're going to look at the frontline supervisors, and the company's going to look to those frontline supervisors as their first line of defense, right?
Yes.
Sure, those supervisors are a key component to this campaign. So what could from a company's standpoint, what are the main operations of a frontline supervisor in fighting off that union or winning that campaign for the company instead of the union?
Well, if you look at it, James, in phases, and let's take the first phase as card mitigation.
Dan, if I could interrupt you right there for a second, what exactly do you mean by card mitigation? What are the cards you're referring to?
Yeah, I appreciate that, James. Let me elaborate on that. What I mean by card mitigation is the formal process by the National Labor Relations Act where the union must obtain interest from the employees, and that obtaining the interest is actually gained by a collection of authorization cards or signatures from the employees authorizing that, yes, they do have interest to be represented by the union. That's what I refer to as card mitigation. And clearly the supervisor, as that guard and the first line of defense, they must be able to maintain an awareness to what's that card look like. You don't want them to be blinded and deaf to the situation. You want them to be well versed. Again, just to have that understanding to witness it, identify it, and know how to react. So, our methodology and what we wish to encourage our clients to do is to offer that necessary education to the supervisors so they do understand that card mitigation process.
And you know what? That's why it's so important for a company to get ahead of the curve. I mean, we're talking about, yes, given the training and the education, but once there is union activity, then it's a whole different ball game. If the frontline supervisors for many companies are just that. They're the first line of defense for the company. If there's union activity, if there's issues going on, they know about it. The smart company, and if they give training prior to any union activity being there and establish that trust and that relationship with their employees, you're going to even have a better front line of defense, because it won't be just your frontline supervisors, it's going to be your employees themselves.
And also, James, let me add to that. I know that Rick and I, in working in this environment for years, we both would agree nothing will inoculate you from a union attempt. Nothing can completely insulate you from the outside interests wanting to come in and be a part of your structure. However, what you can do is somewhat have that barrier to try to suppress them to the best that you can. Because it ultimately is the more success that the company has, clearly the union wants to be able to jump on that coattail.
Right, Dan, but once again, unions are like water flowing downhill. They're going to take the least restrictive or a path. So if there is a something blocking them, it's going to turn and go somewhere else. It's going to go to the easiest target. So when they look at a company and they see that there's a strong foundation, that there's a strong relationship, that there's good communication, they're going to look at that and say, well, maybe this isn't where we want to go. Because you have to understand that the organizer or the head of the organizing department, which is what I did, we would look at how much money we're going to spend and how many successes that we had. At the end of the quarter, we would be in a big room with Nationwide, and they would be looking at our successes, how much money we spent per win. So our goal, if you want to further your career within the union infrastructure, your goal had to be, as few organizing elections with as many wins. So if you see that it's not going to be a winner, it's not going to benefit you to say, okay, well, we tried or we did an attempt. It's not about that trying. It's all about dollars and cents. How much did we gain and how much did we spend? That's the bottom line. If you want to advance yourself, that's what you have to do.
Yeah, but Rick, as we know, as we've talked to clients in the past, what you just said, though, about the dollars and cents of unionization, that's one of the hardest obstacles that management has, and even we do as practitioners contracted to help them, and educating that first-line supervisor to understand the financial impact of unionization, because they don't see how it impacts them.
Right.
The company, the stakeholders, the executives, sure, they have a better appreciation to, holy cow, unionization and the detriment financially, but that supervisor's saying, wait a minute, it's not going to affect my checkbook.
Well, right, absolutely, Dan. In fact, how many times have we asked management in training classes that we've held, what is the reason you don't want a union here? And all they do is regurgitate what they've heard from upper management. But they really don't have an understanding of how it could personally affect them and how much money it could cost the company and how that could affect their ability, to grow with the company.
Let's say a company has missed out on that first phase, that first card mitigation phase. A union is campaigning now inside their company. We've lost the chance to set up that preventative wall around the company. What can a company do now via their frontline supervisors to win that campaign against the union?
Well, James, unfortunately, game on. Game on, James. They are past that process of card mitigation, and now they have received formal notice from the National Labor Relations Board that a petition has been filed involving their employees and that an election will be conducted. Game on. At that point, we instruct many companies that literally you need to stay focused without tunnel vision of what you think were the issues that developed to get you here to where the petition has been filed. You need to win that campaign. And clearly the role of the supervisor has to come in play. They must be educated to understand the time sensitivity involved in managing a campaign and how they too must be on board to maintain that effective communication to those voting.
Yeah, and the problem with once the process and the game is on, Dan, the harder it is to establish that, because and the campaign and the frustration may have been built, and it may even not even be accurate, but the perception of unfairness, the perception of favoritism is the same. It's reality. But the longer it goes before management starts to engage with employees, the harder it is to do it. The first thing when I was on the other side, the first thing that the union's in there to destroy the relationship, because nobody joins a union, nobody votes for a union when it comes time for the election with a company that they enjoy, with management that they have a good relationship and a good communication with. So when a petition is filed, the first thing management tells their supervisors to do. What's the first thing that they tell the supervisors to do, Dan? Go out and communicate. Go out and talk to them.
Right.
Go out and talk to them. Well, by this time, the union's already, face it, nobody's reinventing the wheel. The union went out there and said, this is what the company's going to do. They're going to try to start being best friends with you. They're going to try to start talking to you. But what happened to them the last year? They haven't been doing it. So in other words, it's playing right into the union's hand. That's why it's so much harder to deal with after the petition has been filed.
But James, if I could follow up on what Rick is saying, there too, the supervisor winds up becoming a punching bag. Because
right.
Now all of a sudden the management is like, oh, wait a minute, they're putting on their armor, they're getting their swords, they're getting their shields, they're there for the fight. And they're telling the first line supervisor, come on, now you have to take guard now. Now we have to take a defensive position because the union is being offensive against us. They have filed a petition, they're attacking, we must defend ourselves. And the supervisor is the one standing there as the first line of attack against them now to try to blunt that attack. And they feel that. Believe me, we have all too often the supervisors coming back up to us saying, time out. I am tired of getting slapped in the face and taking the punches for you. Where are you in supporting of me now?
Right. So I think one of the most important things there, and something we might not have touched on already, is that these employees have been told, by their management and by their supervisors to approach those frontline supervisors first with any questions they have about their workplace. And if a supervisor is not educated about the union, not educated about union politics and labor relations politics and all these processes that come into play, they're not going to have the right answers for their employees, and who's going to be there with the answers but a union representative?
James, and that's why the first thing we do when there's a petition is that we have to wash the slate clean. We have to get those supervisors educated. During an organizing campaign, it's like a gun's pointed at you and the trigger is pulled. You have to dodge that bullet. You have to get through that election. So you have to be able to utilize the best supervisors, the best communicators, and utilize them to go out and consistently pass out that message.
Yeah, and the executive leadership, a lot of times, James, by the time that we're engaged once the petition is filed and we're talking to the executive leadership about the situation to assess what our first steps are going to be, a lot of times they point the finger back to the first line supervisor to say, well, ultimately, obviously, they must have failed. Because this wouldn't have happened if they would have maintained appropriate communication. Obviously, they failed. Look, what worse can you do except to put them into the ground and bury them? You need to lift them up and bring them back to the surface to know that you do have their support because you need them with that armor on.
Like, and 90% of the time when we get a call that there's a petition, the first question I will ask is, were you surprised that there's organizing activity? And 90% of the time, the answer is yes, we're surprised. When we go and start talking to the supervisors, and many times we said, well, we had no idea. But a week or two into the campaign, after they've been educated, it's always, now that I think about it, this issue came up. Now that I think about it, this wasn't quite strange. But we never put two and two together. We never thought about it. And once again, that is why it's so important to have supervisors, management, trained ahead of the curve before the lion's at the door.
So, so let's say past the campaigning process, what would a supervisor do in a situation like a strike?
Well, the strike, wow. There's only so many things that could happen if the union wins the right of representation. They could reach a contract, an impasse could be reached, or a strike. No one likes to hear of strikes, James. That word sends shivers up my back, as well as probably every employer out there. And the supervisor is stuck in the middle of it. Because obviously if the employees walk out, more times than not, the supervisor now is carrying a double and triple duty because someone has to fulfill that role on the line. Someone has to take over that nursing position. Someone else has to pick up the mop on the floor. And a lot of times the supervisor's now to take on more tasks. Again, how does that make them feel? Do they really feel that they are being supported for their actions and their contribution to the company as part of leadership? Or do they now just feel like they're being prostituted?
I was a strike director also, and I've worked on many strikes across the country, and some pretty violent ones. The last strike that I worked on was the Detroit newspaper strike here in Detroit, Michigan, and that from the time they went on strike to the time they got a contract was almost 7 years. Once again, it's going back to preventing these things from going on, because once there's a strike, it is scorched earth policy. The supervisors, because the supervisors have to anticipate that the workers might be coming back if there's a settlement to the strike. Whether there's permanent replacement workers in there that take the jobs or temporary replacement workers. But if there's a settlement, then at some point in time, some of these workers might be coming back. So how do they communicate with the workers? At that point in time, it's scorched earth policy. The supervisors are the enemy. There is a hatred, there is a mistrust that may never be healed. It may never be healed because the supervisors had to go across the line, and their responsibility is to do whatever it takes to keep their company operating and moving forward. And once again, the hatred and the anger and the distrust is so strong that there may never be once again a regular relationship. And I've seen families who one brother was a supervisor and the other brother was out on the strike line, and they stopped talking. I see the husbands and wives who were in that same position break up and separate and divorce. I mean, the destructive nature of a strike is so complex, and so it takes over everything.
So what it seems like is that a supervisor to the employee and even to the union to some degree gets lumped in with the company. They become part of the company, which during a union campaign, what a union's trying to do is promote that dichotomy, that diatribe against the company. So I feel like what a company really has to do then for its frontline supervisors is to show that support, to not throw them under the bus, to express that support. And I think one of the most effective ways they could do that is provide proper training so they can handle things like this and not see, as you said, Dan, before, not be seen by themselves as prostitutes.
Right. And, really, God willing, they win the campaign. As Rick is talking about the destructive nature that a campaign can endure on a company as a final result, post-campaign and the activities that are promoted post-campaign, seriously, you have to make sure that you're engaging back with your employees. As much of those non-monetary values that employees appreciate, respect, dignity, fairness, that has to start with the leadership too. They have to feel that they too are treated equally and fair, and that there's not a biasness just because they're part of leadership. So as long as we maintain that good nature with our supervisors, and you have to focus on that, they will disseminate that information onward.
Dan, one of the things when I was an organizing director, and one of the things that we used to say is that we only have to win once, and the company has to win every time. And so many times there's a campaign, the company wins, and they go back to business as usual. And every time the union has an election, and they can have it once a year, so every time they have an election, the percentage of their win ratio goes up if management does not change how they communicate with their employees. So even if you win, you have a divided workforce. Just because you won the election doesn't mean everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya. It doesn't happen like that. You have to address and rebridge that gap that caused the problem in the first place, or it's going to repeat itself.
Okay, so let's say then we're talking about if a company has won this union campaign. What about on the flip side of that coin? What is the role of a supervisor in a unionized environment? What is a unionized supervisor, or a supervisor in a company with a union present? What is that role?
Well, James, there's two schools of thought that we look at in a unionized versus non-unionized environment. One of them is to do things right, and then we look at the counter of that as to do the right thing. And in a unionized environment, there are restrictions. You have now a union contract, a collective bargaining agreement that specifically spells out how the employees will be treated according to their hours, their work conditions, wages, and compensation. Everything is black and white. There is no gray. There is no middle ground. It is all spelled out. And literally, the union, they look at the role of the supervisor as a robot then. If there's a question or concern about discipline or compensation or anything at all, what's the book say? Do things right according to the book. Then you have a negative aspect to that, where in a unionized environment, unionization has a negative impact to the flexibility. The ability to do the right thing. The flexibility is so important. And clearly the supervisor has to make sure that they understand the essence of why the flexibility is needed.
One of the issues that we have during organizing campaigns, and why we have to really look at a lot of the frontline supervisors. How does a union get frontline supervisors to support their organizing campaign? And one of the things is exactly what you were just talking about, Dan. If the union comes in here, because if you're working at a warehouse or you're working at a hospital, say for instance a warehouse, and if you're short-handed, what does a supervisor have to do, Dan? They have to hop on that high-low, they have to drive it, they have to move it, they have to do the work. So in a unionized shop, and we're not looking at the flip side of that coin, but in a unionized shop, they're going to say, you know what, life's going to be better for me because all I have to do is give orders. The physical aspect of the job will be much easier for me. Also, guess what? If the union is able to increase their wages and benefits, I'm going to get better too, and that's what we used to tell them. If we get better benefits, if we get better raises, they're going to have to make yours better also to keep the incentive of being a supervisor. And there's other issues also. A lot of times you go into a lot of places, small towns, where there's a facility where the people are hired from that vicinity. And a lot of times the people who are the supervisors, and that's why it's so important to know who your supervisors are, grew up with a lot of these people that are working for you. You played softball together. You grew up. So where is their loyalty? Is it going to be to the company, or is it going to be to somebody who used to have sleepovers with you and vacations with you when you were a kid? More than likely it's going to be your lifelong friends that you're going to have the dedication to. So that's, once again, training is everything. Really understanding who the people you put in those positions as supervisors are also.
James, once again, let me expand on Rick's point, because the unions know. The unions know darn well that if they win and they're in, they understand how the management and the first line supervisor and the employees involved, now the union members, become immune to the pain because it becomes routine now. We've had clientele that we have worked with through a process, and during the struggle, that controversy of whether it's card mitigation and they're signing authorization cards, there's leafleting, the company is involved in an actual campaign with an NLRB petition, and there's a upcoming election. That has so much stress and anxiety to it. Everyone is affected directly by it. The first line supervisors are completely in disarray sometimes because they're literally pulling their hair out because they don't know. It's such a direction coming from everywhere. There's communication coming from both sides. And the union knows completely well that once they're in, the next supervisor becomes accustomed to the routine and they are immune to that pain.
Yeah, and in the organizing process also, the first thing when the union comes in is they're going to dissect that whole facility. They're going to get a war room and who are your friends, who do you know, who do you like, who you don't like. They're going to dissect the employees and the frontline supervisors to know everything about them, to know if they have weaknesses, or to know the strengths, so they can try to utilize those relationships to promote their organizing campaign.
So once again, and as always, I want to bring it back to what have we learned and what can companies do to train their supervisors to be an effective, exactly that, a frontline supervisor. What can they do to be the first line of that company's defense, and to also make themselves accessible in a way that the employees will approach a supervisor with a problem instead of turning towards a union?
But James, I'll start off by saying my advice to any member of executive leadership is to honestly attempt to gain an appreciation, a true, sincere appreciation to the value of the first line supervisor in general. To understand their role, as we have explained it, and to understand the influence and the impact that the supervisor can have long term to their labor relations position, as well as in maintaining a positive employee relations environment. So saying that, I look at it this way. In as far as the supervisor is concerned, the union will take complete advantage of that person and their lack of intelligence, or perhaps their ignorance on the issues.
Sure.
And they will exasperate the situation, and they will be able to spoon feed the supervisor in order to try to gain their trust as well, get them to drink the Kool-Aid and support the drive, and all of a sudden now you have a rogue on the side of leadership coming across.
And also, I think that it's important to recognize and to understand that putting the resources into management training is a tangible endeavor. And that's why a lot of times management does not put the effort and the resources into training management, because they feel that it's not tangible for them to do so. And it's a misconception, and the training, nothing can be more important as far as, so many things that you can't even calculate how it costs. You're talking about, employee turnover rate, you're talking about productivity, you're talking about all kinds of things. If you have to have an organizing campaign, once a union sets its targets on you, the amount that it's going to cost your company in human communications, as far as money goes also, is just enormous. It can destroy a company, it can hurt a company, and it can destroy lives.
And this training, James, is not a one-shot deal. We've talked to many clients who are facing the reality of witnessing a true campaign, whether they have a petition or they're in card mitigation. And what is it we hear all the time? Oh, we never saw this coming. Well, why would you think that you were immune to this? Well, we did some training with our management 10 years ago. I don't care if you did it 3 years ago. This is a necessary component that should be in your annual review every year for your management, for every level of your leadership, to make sure that they are well versed and abreast to the current environment of labor relations, and always keep that awareness intact so that they can read and identify the signs and symptoms of unionization.
And Dan, I think you'll agree with me that all too many times we are used as corporate firemen. Firefighters, when the flames getting hot, that's when they call us, instead of preparing themselves before, so there is no fire. We get called, there's an emergency coming out now, we have problems, and we have to go out and try to put out the fire. But the company that's really thinking ahead is a company that's going to say, well, let's insulate our company against these fires, first of all. So it too many times we're used as an emergency device and not as maintaining their positive management relations.
The preventative.
Sure.
Right.
Don't buy fire insurance, just don't leave the stove on. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for the conversation today. I think we touched on some valuable subjects. Dan, it was a pleasure having you. It was nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Rick, always a pleasure. And we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.